everybody. Bear with me while I get all the technology working.
Can you guys hear in the back? Yeah, awesome. Okay. Welcome, everybody. We're going to talk about a bunch of things today, about finance, about how it is that the cotton regime of the Old South gets connected to the credit regime of Great Britain, and Moby Dick, and the relationship between all of these things. Moby Dick is a story that you may have read in school, depending on the school that you went to. It's great as a graphic novel also. The classic comics version is fantastic. It's a massive book. And there's a few metaphors in Moby Dick that are probably familiar to most people. One of them, the white whale, the thing that you become obsessed with, your hated enemy that drives you for the rest of your life. For some people, that white whale is wealth. For other people, it's power. And I want to talk about the white whale and talk about where it comes from. Explaining what Moby Dick is about has destroyed the careers of over 100 PhD English students who've tried to kind of capture what this is. But I want to tell you, I know what it is. I want to tell you that there is an explanation for Moby Dick, but to understand it, you actually have to understand quite a bit about finance and international capitalism. And that's what I want to talk about today. You have to understand the Panic of 1837. You have to understand Andrew Jackson's Bank War. You have to understand the political conflicts, middle of the 19th century, and you have to understand slavery and its relationship to capitalism. So, with that as a start, to talk about Moby Dick, we ought to begin with the ocean, and we must begin on ships because the drama of Captain Ahab's quest is a story of two conflicts. The conflict between the men on the ship and the captain, and the whale, the conflict with the whale. The whale, of course, has the advantage. Time and tide flow wide, Melville tells us, and the hated whale has the round, watery world to swim in, as the small goldfish has its glassy globe. What is Moby Dick about, and how does it have to do with the South? In 1851, this is not an actual photograph of Captain Ahab, but it's from a film. He's the captain of the Pequod who aims to kill the white whale, Moby Dick. And I'm just going to quickly bounce over to the Slido for those of you that might have come in a minute or two late on the Twitch. In 1851, Nathaniel Hawthorne was asked to comment on an early draft of the novel, and that letter is not available. It's gone, and I'm fairly certain it was actually destroyed by Melville himself, because in it, Hawthorne not only figured out that Melville's book was an allegory, that is, a story with a hidden meaning, but Hawthorne saw the meaning that Melville himself didn't understand when he was writing the novel. He wrote back, I had some vague idea while writing it, Melville wrote to Hawthorne's sister, that the whole book was susceptible of an allegorical construction, that is, a story about something else, and also that parts of it were, but the specialty of many of the particular subordinate allegories were first revealed to me after reading Mr. Hawthorne's letter, which intimated the part and parcel allegoricalness of the whole. In other words, Melville wrote the book kind of with an eye to recognizing that it was about something. But he didn't actually understand what it was about until Nathaniel Hawthorne explained it to him. Does that make sense? He didn't understand what the kind of story was about until Hawthorne explained it. But Melville, I think, very purposely destroyed the letter, because that's the great thing about good literature, is that you never want to reveal the secret. You never want to reveal the underlying story that intimate is because then it becomes, for critics and others, a kind of story about how true is this. Okay, and so this big old image took me maybe 3 or 4 years to figure out, but it explains credit and how credit moves across the Atlantic economy in the 1800s. Okay, so from the left to right, interest rates. This is the money that it costs to borrow. Right now, as you probably know, it just went up to 4%. Actually, what's the Fed rate? Now, the Fed rate's not 4%. Mortgages just went to 4%, so I think the Fed rate went up to something like 3.25%. But interest rates in the United States in this period were something like 8 to 25%. For banks that dealt with transatlantic trade that borrowed in Britain and lent in Europe, it was around 5%, and inside Britain itself, it was around 3%. Okay, how does all this work? How does credit work? How is all these credit tied together? Just 4 days ago, the London Metal Exchange just collapsed. It's existed since 1811 or something like that, and the London Metal Exchange folded in large part because nickel prices had gone up to an astronomical level and then plummeted, and no one could fill the contracts on London Metal Exchange. And so the London Metal Exchange basically effectively stopped, and JP Morgan Chase and others lost $40 billion, something like that, just in the last couple of days. And this has to do with this very tightly bound up international market. And of course, the reason that nickel prices went up is because of Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. Most nickel comes from Russia and Ukraine. Okay, so let's go back to this story. Let's start on the right then, at the top. British investors, British people with capital, remember that you've got these families in Great Britain, some of which have a great deal of money. Some of that money comes from being, the nabobs, the people who are connected to the East India Company. Others have just generated capital for years, many involved in the slave trade previously. They're putting their money in deposits into banks, and they're getting about 1 to 2% from the banks. These rural joint stock banks. The rural joint stock banks need to invest in something. Remember that picture of the bank where the bank teller was pushing notes and he had gold underneath the table, and he had in that blue slip a bunch of loans that he was holding? That loans, he has to loan to someone and make more than 5%, right, to be able to pay people 2%. And so what he does is he buys Lombard Street bills. And these are bills that are trading back and forth in London, not far from the London Metal Exchange. And these Lombard Street bills are notes, basically loans, short-term loans of about 90 days, that are around 4.5% and 5%. The Lombard Street bills are being issued by this group of banks, merchant bankers, called the Seven Houses. And this is 7 merchant houses. This is Baring, the Baring brothers. This is the Rothschilds. This is a number of other major banks. And they are transatlantic banks that need short-term money, these 7 houses. And they're connected with cotton. By and large, getting cotton from the American South to Europe. Now, they're bringing other goods too. They're bringing goods from India. They're bringing goods from other parts of the British Empire. But there's a fairly large percentage of this borrowing and lending that's for delivering cotton. The cotton, so they're issuing these Lombard Street bills. They are in turn taking sterling bills of exchange, which are another kind of short-term credit that's actually used for shipping goods back and forth on the Atlantic. And the people who are borrowing at something like 8% are the Second Bank of the United States and something called the agency banks. The agency banks, in turn, are issuing state banknotes and providing loans for the long-term delivery of cotton. Those notes, that credit at 9%, at 10%, and 11%, is what people who own other people, enslavers, use to buy and expand into the West. Remember I said this is a boom and bust economy with these commodities? People are using these loans at a high interest rate. They're paying a high interest rate, but they're using them to buy people in New Orleans who've been shipped down the river from Virginia and South Carolina. And so finally, at the very bottom, we're talking about land and enslaved people. These people are buying land, they're buying enslaved people, and they're starting to grow cotton. There are questions. I'm glad there are questions because this is complicated. Who buys these bills? The sound cut out. So basically, the bills, let's see, so the yellow are pieces of paper, right? And so the yellow is the deposits. The Lombard Street bills are effectively loans from the joint stock banks to the 7 houses. The sterling bills of exchange are loans from the 7 houses to the banks of the United States and agency banks in the United States. The other slips of paper are effectively loans to enslavers, and they're issuing state banknotes, silver, and Dixies. Does that make sense? So you've got these slips of paper passing back and forth. Everybody's hoping to make a buck. The cost to borrow increases each time you pass from one note to another. Does that make sense? I know this sounds a little complicated. The point is that there are many points of failure here, but also many institutions whose lives are kind of on the line with these notes. The 7 houses are making sure that these sterling bills of exchange are going from legitimate banks. The banks are making sure that these loans are going to legitimate slaveholders, enslavers. The rural joint stock banks are making sure that the 7 houses are reliable. So there is a kind of trust that's going back and forth that makes all this lending possible. But what it means, in the longest term sense, is that somebody who puts 200 pounds in a bank in Manchester, they don't know it, but they're investing in transatlantic slavery. Does that make sense? They're investing in this long-term flow of credit to bring cheap cotton to England. And England needs cotton because cotton goods are the British Empire's calling card around the world. Cheap cotton goods are the things that Britain can bring to any port and sell because it's cheaper than that's being produced anywhere else in the world. Dixies. You've heard that word, Dixieland. Where does it come from? It comes from the place where the steamboats traveled up and down the Mississippi River. And steamboat captains referred to the French side of the Mississippi River, basically the western side of the Mississippi River, as the place where you could use French banknotes that said 10 on the front and Dix on the back. Dixieland was the land that was basically Louisiana, right? And so that's where we get the word Dixie from. What it speaks to, Dixieland speaks to, is this long-term credit system. And this note, remember, a banknote is not a direct representation of wealth. It's a representation of a loan, right? Just like in that bank, where the representation of, where the notes that the guy is pushing across the table are themselves, there is gold under the table, but gold can't possibly cover all of the notes that are being issued. Ultimately, what you're doing when you take a note in your hand is you are effectively acting as a lender for some other financial transactions that are going on. Same thing when you hold a dollar bill. You're holding not currency in Fort Knox, gold in Fort Knox. What you're holding is a series of US federal debt that's bought and sold over an international market every day. Okay? But it's different in this period because it's not federal debt. It's basically debt for the extension of slavery into the West. Nicholas Biddle is the head of the new Second Bank of the United States. And he is keen on replacing this whole system with himself, bypassing the second banks, the other agency banks, putting himself in between basically offering Lombard Street bills in London. The Second Bank of the United States has an office in London, very near the exchange. He's going to issue notes, Lombard Street notes, And he's going to, on the other hand, and that's going to be his way of borrowing from London, and his way of lending in the United States is going to be to issue bank drafts, which are the banknotes of the Second Bank of the United States. And his hope is that these are going to be so stable and so ordinary and so regular that anyone will take these notes over the Bank of Mississippi or the Bank of Louisiana or the Bank of East Arkansas. Remember, a whole bunch of banks failed in 1819? A bunch of new banks have started up, but some of them are risky. And so his idea is to basically replace them. Do you see how this could make someone the wealthiest person in the Atlantic? Because you're borrowing at 3% and lending at 18%, right? This is how JP Morgan becomes incredibly wealthy, is transatlantic lending. He wants to replace this whole system with himself. And he's got a whole plan to do it. And it is somewhat, I mean, according to him, is just introducing stability into the system, because who knows when one of the 7 houses will fail? Who knows when one of these other agency banks is going to fail, just like it did in 1819. All you have to do is trust me. I have the imprimatur of the United States. That's what he's relying on. We talked about the election of 1824, and now I want to talk about Andrew Jackson. So the election of 1824, Jackson, as he saw it, was robbed of this election. The election of 1824 brought John Quincy Adams to the presidency. And this new party that increasingly calls itself the Democratic Party, dreamed up in the head of Martin Van Buren, is a party that is opposed to John Quincy Adams, opposed to Henry Clay and everything they stand for. They don't want a north-south divide. They want a little bit of an east-west divide. They want a little bit of a, they're New York workers, and they want Southern planters, and it's a kind of coalition party. Jackson has a cabinet, but he's forced by his party to choose the members of his own cabinet, so he creates something called a kitchen cabinet. The kitchen cabinet is newspapers, and newspapers are going to be the source of Jackson's power. Jackson chooses, I'm sorry about the colors here. I went a little crazy with the color scheme. We've got Frank Preston Blair on the right there. Duff Green, the craziest looking man of the 19th century, perhaps. Crazier even than John Brown. We have James Watson Webb. Let's see. Duff Green runs the Washington newspaper that is the official party organ of the Democratic Party. He's basically attacking John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay and other people all the time in the newspaper. He's actually got he's allowed to reprint the Annals of Congress himself. He makes sure that the Annals of Congress don't go into the South, because a criticism of slavery should not be repeated and delivered in the South. Frank Preston Blair is in, where is he? I think he's in Missouri. I'm pretty sure he's in Missouri. And he is one of the big Western papers. It's either Missouri or Ohio. James Watson Webb has the biggest paper in New York. So these newspaper guys get together on a regular basis, and they kind of make the news that Andrew Jackson wants. Right? Now, the idea of a partisan news agency, I'm sure, is very surprising and shocking to you. Luckily, we don't have organizations like that anymore. I'm kidding. In the 19th century, though, newspapers are heavily partisan, right? So if if a Democrat ran over somebody who's a supporter of John Quincy Adams on the street, their carriage, the Democratic newspapers would say there was a drunken supporter of John Quincy Adams who was run over by a car, and the reporting in another newspaper would be that an insane, out-of-control Democrat had run over a strong, upstanding supporter of John Quincy Adams. Every piece of news was political in this period. Yes, he was very good. So the question here was, wasn't he very big on the idea of the common man? Yes. He, and so in some sense, and Watson talks about this, in some sense, we see more democracy under Adams. It's called, some people call it the age of democracy. White men who don't have property increasingly are allowed to vote. On the other hand, Jackson also tries to block black men from voting in New Orleans and elsewhere. So he's, in one sense, a common man, but a supporter of the common man. He has he's beloved by people in part because he's a warrior general. Remember that sword that he had in that image before, Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered, right? And so it's this military bearing that Jackson has that's so important. What paper was Duff Green in charge of? I think it was the Washington Examiner. You probably want to Wikipedia it though, or Google it. But Duff Green, I think it was the Washington Examiner, but it could have been, it was the Washington newspaper, the major Washington newspaper, and I can't remember it offhand. Okay. So it was as I said, it was Nicholas Biddle's dream to replace himself with all these other institutions. He wants to create something called bank drafts. He wants to issue Lombard Street bills to borrow in England. He hoped to become the biggest fish in the ocean. And over the 1830s, he began to make this happen by trying to reach around the seven houses and drive out the local banks, which he believed were badly managed. Some of them were. Critics called the second bank the monster bank because it threatened to devour the other banks. They also called it the whale. So, 1824, Jackson loses. The 1824 is the beginning of Andrew Jackson's campaign for the 1828 presidency, and by 1828, he wins by a landslide. The Democratic Party is created, and in 1828, when Jackson is inaugurated, so a couple of people asked last time what Andrew Jackson stood for. He didn't really stand for anything at first. He just stood for not John Quincy Adams and not Henry Clay. So whatever John Quincy Adams believes, I don't believe it. Whatever Henry Clay believes, I don't believe it. A lot of people say a lot of things about Andrew Jackson. Not really. I don't want to be too mean here about other historians, but basically, one of the things that Andrew Jackson believed in was free trade between the U.S. and Great Britain, no more tariffs, basically widespread trade. He did not believe in states' rights. He believed that there should be a strong national executive, himself in particular. He believed in expelling Indians from the northern part of Georgia. And he initiates the Trail of Tears under his presidency. But in 1831, Jackson mentions offhandedly, first to his kitchen cabinet and then to others, that he doesn't like this second bank of the United States. Now at this point, the second bank of the United States doesn't hate Jackson. Biddle and Jackson don't necessarily see eye to eye. But Jackson, while he favors free trade and these other sorts of things, is somewhat suspicious of this guy, Nicholas Biddle. And he says in a public speech that he might not recharter the second bank of the United States. And Biddle freaks out. And that's when we get a new party that emerges called the WIGS. Who's in the WIGS? John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. So this second party system initially had been everybody who didn't like Clay and Adams becomes Democrats. By 1831, a new party is consolidated against Jackson. They call themselves the Whigs. Now, Whig, in the context of the 19th century and the 18th century, meant people who opposed the strong power of the king. And so the idea of Whig is they opposed King Jackson, they said, because Jackson was assuming too much power. He was, in fact, replacing various members of any federal institutions with supporters of his political party. Jackson does this mostly through Martin Van Buren, but Martin Van Buren gets people in federal jobs to pay back a portion of their salaries to the Democratic Party, to sustain the Democratic Party. And so the Whig Party is organized in Nicholas Biddle's office, I think. There's some evidence that the Whig Party is created in Nicholas Biddle's office. But the one person who becomes important, they need a newspaper. And that's where James Watson Webb comes into the picture. James Watson Webb becomes the traitor to the Democratic Party, the person who is going to make this possible. He knows all the inside dirt about Andrew Jackson. He's this editor of the New York Courier and Inquirer, which was the largest newspaper in the United States. He had been on cabinet. He needs a loan because he's constantly trying to get the latest news from everywhere. He has steamships that he sends out to boats that are kind of on their way into New York to get the latest news. He creates a steam-powered press. He's got an amazing, what's the word? He's obsessed with himself. He loves himself. He's a narcissist, an incredible narcissist. And he needs a loan, and Nicholas Biddle, in 1831, after he sees the threat of Andrew Jackson, offers him a huge loan. Webb then turns around and opposes Jackson and supports the recharter of the Second Bank of the United States. And Andrew Jackson discovers this when he opens up a New York newspaper and discovers that Watson has changed sides. And it's him in 1832 that first uses the term WIGS to describe those opponents. Okay, does that make sense? So we now have a real two-party system. We have the Whigs that are opposed to Andrew Jackson, and we have the Democrats that were opposed to Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams, and we have issues that they stand for and against. The tariff, for and against internal improvements, but not on the issue of slavery. On the issue of slavery, both Democrats and Whigs believe that slavery is a good thing, or at least not a bad thing. When Jackson reads that newspaper, he determines that he will now destroy the Second Bank of the United States. And Andrew Jackson's dream is a little bit crazy. He believes that he can somehow do without Great Britain, which is actually impossible, but it's not like he understands finance that well. And so he wants to create an internal connection between the basically the westward expansion, which is where people are making money hand over fist by building slave regions in the Southwest. He wants to do this by creating a series of new democratic banks that are going to support the Democratic Party. Opponents call those the pet banks. And he believes that the federal government is going to be issuing treasury bills and U.S. deposits, and that's going to be where the loans are going to come from. Now, how he doesn't understand, and most people don't, precisely how this international commodity exchange works. But it turns out that you can't really do without Great Britain here, the kind of, by this point, a world-spanning empire. Okay, and then so there's a few things that he does, and you don't really need to know this, point by point, but it's important just because, well, I mean, historians, the reason most English professors and English students of English don't understand Moby Dick is because they don't understand this sort of financial stuff. But what does he do? In 1833, he removes federal deposits from the Second Bank. In 1834, he issues the Coinage Act, which officially changes the value of silver to gold to draw gold onto the market. In 1836, the Distribution Acts, where he takes all the federal deposits and distributes them among his pet banks. And then in 1836, the Specie Circular that says you could only buy federal land with gold or silver. This whole system of expansion, which depends on people being able to buy land with money from the agency banks, with currency from the agency banks, with Dixies, with all these other sorts of things, this is suddenly a problem very quickly. What is a pet bank? A pet bank is basically a bank that is in the pocket of Andrew Jackson, right? And so it's a bank, it's called, the Second Bank, or the First Bank of Kentucky, or the First Bank of Tennessee, but it's basically a Jackson bank. It's basically a Democrat bank. It's a bank that supports the Democratic Party. Does that make sense? These banks, it turned out, just like in 1818, were not especially stable. Many of them get loans and never pay them back. Yeah, so that's what a pet bank is. So the Coinage Act creates what are called Jackson's mint drops, which are gold coins, which are supposed to be the foundation of American borrowing and lending. This seems like not a terrible idea. Gold is actually discovered in the hills of Georgia and North Carolina, southern North Carolina. There are some banks that are created there. There is gold in Georgia. There's gold in them Var Hills. It's a phrase that is coined in Georgia in the 1830s, but it's not enough gold to replace the entire world Atlantic money supply, which is what Jackson's hope is to do. And this is what happens to American land sales. They peak in 1836, and then, as a result of Jackson's many attempts to rein in the banks, and then finally to say that you can't buy land except using gold or silver, land purchases plummet. When the panic hit, the panic of 1837 hit in Albany, Herman Melville's mother was forced to make a bond, basically a loan of $40,000 to cover the debts that Herman Melville's brother Gansevoort Melville had issued. If you go back a little bit, remember that Melville family were one of the richest families in before the 1819 panic. The Melville family were importers and exporters. The Melville family was quite rich and lived in Massachusetts. Gansevoort, which means duck path in Dutch. Gansevoort is, so you can see there's this Dutch connection here to the Melville family. Gansevoort Melville himself is speculating, just like in the gold in the London Nickel Exchange of 4 days ago or 3 days ago. He's speculating on international markets, and this whole bank collapse is kind of on its way down. And his mother has to make a bond to keep him out of jail for $50,000, which is a lot of money in 1837. Herman Melville's uncle, also bankrupt, Gansevoort was basically bankrupt, ran off to Illinois, abandoning the family estate in the Berkshires. Herman Melville worked in the First Bank of Albany. Herman Melville and others had been had been Democrats, but they had been supporters of, they've been connected to this Bank of Albany. Herman Melville was technically a scrivener, S-C-R-I-V-E-N-E-R, which is basically somebody who records debts for the bank. He's 19 years old. His hope is to, is he that old? No, 17 years old. His plan is to go to college, but that's it for the Melville family. The Melville family loses everything. And he has to leave his job at the Bank of Albany because the Bank of Albany collapses because of the Panic of 1837. Now jobless, Herman returned to the family estate while the family scrambled to pay the back taxes on it. Wandering around this old mansion, examining the peeling wallpaper and the family papers, he reflected on the once proud and wealthy family humbled by the Panic of 1837. After working for a few years as a tutor, he left New York for a life at sea. Years later, in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, in 1850, an older Herman Melville, coming back from the sea, reflected on the course of his life with an allegorical story. He called it, initially, The Whale. It was a story of Ishmael, a simple sailor from an old established family who signs on board a whaling ship led by the crazy Captain Ahab. A driven man with a long scar on his face, the captain's scar is the source of Ahab's rage, much like the scar that Andrew Jackson received from an English officer during the Revolutionary War. Among the Democratic crew that works for Ahab and the bankers at the Bank of Albany who had initially supported Jackson, few fully understood his reckless plan. Had any one of his old acquaintances on shore but half dreamed, I'm now reading from Moby Dick, of what was lurking in him then, how soon would their aghast and righteous souls have wrenched the ship from such a fiendish man. The ship owners, like the Albany Regency, the group of people who had been under Martin Van Buren, had brought Jackson to power. They were, quote, bent on profitable cruises, the profit to be counted down in dollars from the mint, he writes. But Ishmael is learning that crazy Ahab seeks audacious, immitigable, and supernatural revenge. Ahab's enemy is a murderous monster that seems to be everywhere and nowhere. The Saltwater Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States was called the Saltwater Bank because a trade it borrowed in England and lent in the United States. The Saltwater Bank of the United States provided credit for trade across the Atlantic. But while, quote, the accountants have computed their great counting houses the globe by girdling it with guineas, my vengeance will fetch a great premium here, he says, and smashes his chest. Ahab's rage is likewise boundless, for he piled upon the whale's white hump the sum of all the general rage and hate felt by his whole race. In the novel, Ahab nails a gold piece worth 16 silver dollars to the mast, an echo of the Specie Circular, in which Andrew Jackson declared that every dollar was worth 16 ounce of gold was worth 16 ounces of silver. The man who helps Ahab kill the white whale, he says, will receive it. And so the war between Ahab and the monster, this Leviathan, comes to matter more than anything. As the older Melville knew, the battle between captain and monster in 1832 would soon consume them all, driving captain crew and the whale into oblivion. For while the Bank War of 1832 to 1837 helped consolidate Jackson's power and assured Martin Van Buren's election afterwards in 1838, the depression that came in after Van Buren was inaugurated in 1837. So he wins the election for 1838, right before the panic starts. The depression that followed Van Buren's inauguration in 1837 tore the country apart. The Democratic Party, like Ahab's ship, would be shattered by the panic. We now better understand how international credit is a source of tremendous development and tremendous danger, just as Melville did. Skyscrapers, highways, airports, and airplanes are impossible without a tremendous amount of credit. And whether we regard international credit as a repository of pure wealth, as economists sometimes do, or as a repository of human labor, as Marxists do, we see that in the tens of millions of dollars that's international credit is more powerful than any sea creature. For Jackson, the ill that the Bank of the United States did was to corrupt Washington himself. And he wasn't wrong. He wasn't wrong that the Bank of the United States built a new party against him. He wasn't wrong. And that this bank was going to corrupt his own political allies and lead them to move against him. And it's that rage against James Watson Webb, I think, that's crucial to understanding why Jackson continued this war. While that credit could buy loyalty and corrupt a democracy, the credit could also be organized in a way that was calculated to cheapen labor. The asset the bankers in the north of England sought was cheap raw cotton. The cheaper the better, because cheap cotton goods could provide a passport to every international port in the world. These cheap cotton goods made it possible for England to become an international empire. But why were they cheap? because the credit of the saltwater banks went directly to southern planters who owned human beings. These human beings could be driven west to the most productive landscape in the Americas, the Black Belt, called that because of its dark soil. The credit allowed the expropriation of Indians there, and the Trail of Tears, and the creation of a punitive labor system that rewarded force. And it is here that Andrew Jackson's war against the bank, like Ahab's war against the whale, may be most surprising. Which side are we on? The monster bank or Jackson, the president and slaveholder? Those are the two positions to take in this period. There's the two-party system leaves you either on the side of the banks or on the side of Andrew Jackson. No comparable institution emerged to provide easy credit to planters after 1837. Most planters after 1837 had to borrow from each other, which made it harder for them to move west into Texas and up the Mississippi. The new credit bridge between America and England after the Panic of 1837 became railroads. And those railroads were much more successful in the free North than they were in the slave South. Almost 200 years after the Bank War, the South and Southern labor have still not recovered from the system established by the Whale of Lombard Street, the credit of England that helped build the British Empire using the forced labor of 10 million black bodies. Jackson's fatal blow to that credit system in 1837 finally ensured that English credit would no longer populate the Southwest with a system of forced labor. Ironically, it's Andrew Jackson's war against the bank that separates the South from this credit stream that flows across the United States, across the Atlantic. Andrew Jackson destroyed the bank much against his own interest as a slaveholder and a planter. Though we live in a South with a legacy of weak public schools, a Jim Crow legal system, and a military prison industrial complex, it is inarguably better than a system of forced slave labor that broke the swampy plains of Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas. As historians, we are all of us devoted to understanding that legacy, still finding the pieces of driftwood from the 1837 battle between credit and the devoted followers of Ahab, the workers who all went down with their ship. Thanks.